I'm very pleased, and it's my pleasure to be here, to be invited, because first of all, I'm for the first time in Kyiv, in Ukraine. I've never been here before, and I have to say, very curious about the city, but also even more curious about people. And therefore, I wanted to do the following. I want to tell you, I have to say in a simplified way, because for a lecture I can't go into details, but in very simply what happened in Yugoslavia, and because I think many of you are too young even to remember. I think Yugoslav war started for you like Second World War to me, so something that is past long ago. And then discuss the role of intellectuals, because I think it's an important issue that in this situation that you are having here now in Ukraine, you should have on your mind. I'm not going to actually lecture you about what should you do, how should you do it. So I'm speaking basically, as I always write, from the bottom up, from the everyday experience. So take it more like my opinion, my reportage, so to say, more than any kind of a theory. But first, let me tell you, to supplement what you already said, who am I? I'm a writer and journalist. I was born in Croatia and lived there until 1993, and then mostly for the reasons because it was very difficult to work under the conditions that I found myself as some kind of dissident, that is the opponent to nationalism and war. And for the next 10 years I wasn't able to publish in my own country, and I was publishing abroad. But this is not important. The important is that I published 3 books about communism and 3 books about the war. So I perhaps am at this conference in a unique position to speak as somebody who is from Eastern Europe and somebody who lived through the war. Not many people can have this fantastic experience of living through the war, and I do not advise anybody to live through the war if it doesn't need be. So, why about intellectuals? Oh no, rather tell me first, let me tell you first what happened in Yugoslavia. Some of you might, I think most of you were born after 1991, but Yugoslavia, no, okay, but you were babies in 1991, so you can't really remember what happened there. So Yugoslavia was a socialist country. You know, I hope you have noticed that abroad in the West, they call all these countries communist countries. And of course, in the countries themselves, they call the regime socialist countries. No? But I mean, it got so much use, this expression communist countries, that I will be using it too. However, we know it was called socialist country. So what happened in Yugoslavia? It was a socialist country that was outside of the bloc. It was outside of the bloc since 1948. And it consists of 6 republics, and it had 4 languages, and it had 3 religions, and it was a very complicated federal structure. But we lived in peace. And not only we lived in peace, but we mixed very much ethnically together. So, for example, before the war broke out in Bosnia, there were 35% of children from mixed marriages. And so, in other words, there was during the Second World War, something happened in Yugoslavia that was not mentioned later on very much in our school books. And this was the Civil War. There was the war, anti-fascist war. There was also communist revolution with Tito. But there was also a war between Serbs and Croats, a civil war, which had an enormous consequences for the war to come in the Balkans, in former Yugoslavia, and it's actually 3 wars. The war in Croatia, the war in Bosnia, the war in Kosovo. So we are talking about wars in former Yugoslavia, not one war. Now, of course, when it happened, everybody was absolutely shocked. The whole world was shocked. Why? Because this is such a such an independent, beautiful country with very good standard of living, with people living in peace together for, what was it, 45 years or so. Why the war happened there? How come that this was the only country that didn't have velvet revolution, so separation without blood, but there were, in Bosnia, they have a list of close to 100,000 people killed. So I'm only speaking about Bosnia, facts about Bosnia. In Croatia, the number is about 10,000 dead. But then there is about between 30 to 60,000 women being raped in Bosnia only. So these are just to give you glimpses of the numbers. So it's an enormous human tragedy. But how this tragedy happened and why? Well, I remember Alija Izetbegović, who was at that time president of Bosnia, and who in 1992, when already Croatia was at war, he came on television and said, you see this building, this was some skyscraper, and he said, in this building, on the same floor, we have Bosnians, Muslims, we have Serbs, we have Croats living door to door, next to each other. Nobody can divide us. A couple of months later, they were divided. So, there are, I can't really go into all reasons, but in my personal view, there are several important things that happened that facilitated that war, so to say. First of all, unresolved problem from the Second World War, and this is the real number of victims on both sides. I will mention only two topics that are very problematic and still are problematic in our history, and this is Jasenovac. This was a concentration camp where Croats, because Croatia had Ustaše state, it's a fascist state between 41 and 45, killed some 80,000 people, mostly Serbs, communists, and gypsies. And then I will mention another topic, and this is Bleiburg. This is a field in Austria where the defeated army, Ustaše fascist army, but also a lot of civilians withdrew they were going to the west under the, quote, protection of the Allies, and they were killed by Tito's army. So it's a butchery on both sides. You know. But these topics were not really discussed because my belief is, and some of you might recognize that what we had in communist countries was not history. It was ideology. It means history interpreted in the way that the party, Communist Party, wanted it. So that's not really history, no? On one hand. And on the other hand, we had memory, private memory of the people. And the gap between these two ideologized history that we learned at school and was official, and the history that we kept at our heart and spoke about, the memory at the table on Sunday lunch and so on, these were two very dramatically, sometimes dramatically different things, and there was a huge gap that was not bridged even until today. I'm of course mentioning that because it had a huge influence on the causes and reasons for these recent wars. The other element in that war was, but I'm now of course referring to Croatia most of all, is that I think my generation, born after the war, was the last generation of believers in socialism. We lived well, we could travel, we had money, we exchanged it on the black market, went to Trieste to buy shoes, and one of my stories is entitled How we Change Freedom for a Pair of Italian Shoes, which really rings the bell. So we could speak English, we could see foreign movies, read foreign books. There was almost no censorship. So we were very pleased with the situation. What does that mean? It means that the less pressure from totalitarian government, the less resistance. It means that in Poland they had solidarity, right? In Czechoslovakia they had Václav Havel and Charta 77 and so on. In Hungary at the beginning, at that time, that also had some kind of resistance. In Yugoslavia there was no resistance. There was no political democratic alternative. And then when the war, why is it important? When the war started, when the war already started, but I will go to the beginning again, it means that there was only one force organized. In all of these republics that became state, there were only nationalists who were well organized. And they were organized well from before. And then at a certain point, we have a great influx of the nationalists, of the right-wing radicals nationalists from abroad, who came to, for example, Croatia and got instantly citizenship and became instantly very highly positioned in the army and in the government. So without a democratic alternative, without truth about the Second World War, the point is that it was very easy to, in a way, start the war. You had elements there. You cannot start the war just like that. I mean, you can. For example, if you would ask me today to start the war, I can easily do it. I know exactly how to go about that. I'm a journalist. I worked in the media. I know how to make a good propaganda. And I can tell you exactly step by step how to make the war. So if somebody wants to hire me, please, I can do that. I know it sounds very bad, but this is also one of the roles of intellectuals, and this is what I want to talk about. So in this situation, you have then to imagine how intellectuals are. Well, who are the intellectuals at that time? They are, I don't know, writers, poets, academics, professors, what in our communist lingo was called intelligentsia. I don't know if you had, this is a Russian expression actually, so comes from Russian. I know that you probably had the same expression. So, but I think that what is interesting about intelligentsia or intellectuals is the following, that this communist regime produces a certain type of intelligentsia. What type of intelligentsia? These people who are highly educated, they have knowledge, they are, I don't know, doctors or academics or so on. They, at the same time, are totally dependent upon the state. In the socialist countries, they cannot survive out of the state institutions because there is no free market, there is nobody who can live independently. They have to make their living somehow. So they are working in the institutions, they are working in the newspapers, they are working in schools, they are working in academia, but they are all controlled by the Communist Party. That's very clear. So when there is a situation, very volatile situation with communism falling apart, what happens in Yugoslavia is the following. Since 1985, there is a huge struggle between actually between these intelligentsia people on the level of the media, something called media war. What does that mean? It means that there was a lot of writing of a nationalist type before anything happened. This nationalist writing was also in the function of the nationalism in the republics. Especially when Milosevic came into power in the second half of the 80s. No? After 85, it became more and more pronounced nationalism, Serbian nationalism. But it was not directed against Macedonia or against Croatia for that matter. No, it was directed against Kosovo. That Kosovo was the beginning of the war. It's Kosovo. That is the beginning of nationalism, over really strong nationalism. Serbian nationalism is Kosovo, which was at that time autonomous, how do you say, autonomous? autonomous, no, it's not republic, but autonomous pokrajina. How do you say pokrajina? Yeah. So, and it is interesting because this, so to say, nationalism gave wings to Milosevic. Milosevic was an opportunist who his only aim was to stay in power. He, in his head, and I studied quite a lot this person and also wrote about him in the book about the trials in The Hague. He was an opportunist who did not have war in his mind when it all started. He wanted to stay in power, and he understood that by forcing nationalism, riding on the wing of nationalism, he perhaps could do it, and he did it. But there were other nationalisms to count on all around, so it wasn't that he is a nationalist and then what? He is the big boss and then what? I mean, there is a Croatian nationalist, there is also Slovene nationalist, let's not forget that. So then slowly through this writing about nationalism and against each other, especially Serbs against Croats, the atmosphere was created. And this is where, by whom this atmosphere was created? By the journalists, but still under the control of regional nationalist leadership. So somehow we came to this topic that I want to start by showing you two very short clips. We will have to switch off the light for that. So the first one is concerning Sarajevo, and we are going to see and then I'll show you another clip, but just to, well, I don't think this needs very much explanation, right? The other clip that I want to show to you, it's another intellectual. This time it's a Croatian intellectual. His name is Slobodan Praljak. And this gentleman is also born in 45, like Karadzic. He is, engineer of electronics. He is a philosopher, and he is also a movie and a theater director. He finished 3 universities, so highly educated person, who then, in 1993, if you can show us, orders destruction of over 400 years old bridge in Mostar. Mostar is in Bosnia, and it's divided between east and west. In the east it's Muslim quarters, and in the west are Croatian quarters. And this is one of the bridges, the oldest and the most beautiful, that is then destroyed. He ended at the court in The Hague. Karadzic is still, his process is going on, his trial. And Praljak got 20 years sentence, but appealed, and now we don't know what will happen. In the meantime, of course, in Croatia, he is treated as a hero, as is Karadzic in Serbia. But this we can discuss later on. So if you can show us this little clip of the collapse, one of the problems. But when you talk about these issues, it's interesting that people say, my God, how is it possible that a poet, that a person like that could do such a terrible, horrifying thing? To me, the answer is rather self-evident. I think that they are not much different from a carpenter or a taxi driver or a porter or somebody else, or some ordinary, a baker, let's say. But how could they do it? This is not the right question. The right question, in my opinion, is why wouldn't they do it? What do we presuppose is that writers and intellectuals in general are so special that they would not commit a crime, shoot or lust for power, order execution, succumb to corruption. It looks as if they would be, by their education, vaccinated against it. But in spite of enough proofs that they are not, there is still a widespread belief that intellectuals, especially writers, are beings of a higher moral order. After all, they possess knowledge. And this idea about knowledge freeing you free, comes from our Enlightenment tradition. But we are always contradicted by life. So, of course, was I, when my colleagues, writers, journalists, and professors in my own country decide to take automatically the side of the power. The power was nationalist at that time. Before that, they were taking side of the power that was communist. So they just switched like this. And this I find very interesting. Of course, as I told you, in my opinion, the source of such behavior is their position during the communist times. The fact that they could not be free. So I could, this is, I told you about Karadzic, I told you about Praljak, but there is another thing. We already are here at the war. I think what we should pay attention, and this is basically my somehow reason to choose this subject, is preparation for the war. Is the role of intellectuals in psychological preparation. Because I don't think that anybody could kill just like that. Intellectuals, they come handy because they are literate, they have a knowledge, but this knowledge could be, so to say, hired. It could be commanded. It could be manipulated into using words almost as bullets. And what are they doing is preparing by words, by writing, by speaking, by disseminating ideas, they are preparing psychologically the situation for the war. Maybe some of you have read the diaries of Viktor Klemperer, and he's registering in minute details. He also wrote a book about the language, change of the language, and the fascism, but he also records minute details of how the life have changed at the beginning of the fascism, and how the intellectuals, let's call them this way, general name, are creating the other. And this is all about stirring up emotions of hatred by creating the enemy. In other words, in order to have a war, in order to do something, in order to be able to kill somebody or order killing, you have to dehumanize other side. You cannot do it just like that. The command not to kill is very, very strong. So you have to convince your countrymen, first of all, to homogenize them, and then also first of all, to create the enemy and then homogenize the people. This is the task of intellectuals, and most of them were doing it willingly. If you were not willing to do such a thing, you were not in a very good position. As I said, it was preceded by the media war, or the war of words. Journalists from Serbia and Croatia competed with historians and writers describing the other nation as the enemy. And nationalism was politically very instrumental in situation when, let us not forget, inflation had skyrocketed to 2,500%. Can you imagine inflation of 2,500%? They didn't have the prices in the supermarket. They had to change it every 5 minutes, so it was impossible to have the prices. The important thing about this manipulation was that the newspapers were printing the stories from Second World War. They started to count the victims. All the skeletons that we moved under the carpet somehow creeped out. Jasenovac and Bleiburg became the issues. Of course, they became the issues because they were covered before, and mass graves were dug out. The bones were literally counted, and also some people took the bones of their predecessors of their mothers or fathers home from Croatia to Serbia or from Serbia to Croatia. And these myths about Serbs as a celestial people, the other myth of Croats who wanted to have a state for 1,000 years and never succeeded, became more and more used. In other words, when you have a history of nationalism, it is very easy to use it. But then it became rather dangerous at that point. It became rather dangerous because these nationalist forces became more and more organized. As I said, the key role in that place that we didn't have history, but we had ideology. So in that situation, you know what you are supposed to write, and you know how to use this knowledge in order to incite hatred. I didn't mention, maybe I should mention that the most prominent Serbian novelist, Dobrica Ćosić, was president of Serbia at the moment of Srebrenica, when Srebrenica happened. So, you know, it's a kind of a sad counterpoint to Václav Havel. I'm not going to, as I said, mention other names, but I just wanted to say that very briefly, this is not, you could say, okay, they were bought, they were controlled, but there were also some other people who showed that this is not necessarily your choice. You could choose. You can choose in every situation. Even Primo Levi said that you can choose in the worst of situations. Always there is a price to pay, but there is also always a choice. I'd like to borrow one expression from Adam Michnik, who is a historian attending this conference and who at the time of the war wars in former Yugoslavia said that nationalism in former Yugoslavia, contrary to the popular opinion in the West, was not so much repressed as it was forgotten, or better to say, he said it was dormant like a virus. I like to borrow this analogy of nationalism as a virus, which means that you can wake it up at the moment when the conditions are opportune. So this is something that our body is full of viruses, but you don't know exactly when you are going to have a flu, and you are going to have the flu when other conditions are, so to say, good for the flu to develop. And I think this is the best metaphor I have heard about nationalism, that it is a virus. Once in 1991, when the blood was shed, when the blood is shed, that it's a war. And my definition of war is that the war begins when you no longer know names of the victims. So the first victims, you remember the names. You have them here on the square. You have their pictures. This is not the war yet. When you have so many victims that you can't remember them any longer, then this is the war. So, okay, but what about intellectuals? We saw now that they could be bad guys. What about good guys? Can they be good guys? Judging by the behavior of intellectuals in former Yugoslavia, in now independent republics of Serbia, of Bosnia, of Croatia, of Slovenia, well, it seems to me that they didn't learn very much because they cling to the power exactly as they did before. Although now they have much bigger choice. This is now democracy. So, what is democracy in respect to intellectuals? Democracy does not produce dissidents. Democracy only produces people of a different opinion. So if you are expressing different opinion in supposedly a democracy, you are not going to be punished. Theoretically so. But they didn't notice that switch. Why? It is very interesting. Why? Because what happened in Yugoslavia, what happened throughout the Eastern Bloc, the switch of power, the change of political system, even in Russia also. So the change of a political system from communism into democracy does not necessarily mean that building democratic institutions, you have democracy. What remained to be done is to change people and their mentality, and that is happening, but did not really happen. So you have a formal democracy, you have everything what formally democracy required, but this system, the people, is operating according to the old principles, according to the old methods, which is, of course, this is the reason for the corruption, which is along the party lines, along the family lines, and along the dealing and wheeling with your comrades. These remain exactly the same. There is no difference. And while this mentality prevails, it will be very, very difficult. And it is still very, very difficult. So, but okay, what about the good guys? We didn't come to the good guys yet, because I would like to give you an example of Croatian association. It was called Association of Croatian Writers. Collapse of communism didn't produce much change there, and instead of Croatian Association of Writers, it is now named as Association of Croatian Writers. You would think this is not indicative, but it's very indicative. Of course, then we formed another independent association. But I mean, to switch from Croatian Association of Writers to Association of Croatian Writers, it means Serbs are excluded, everybody else is excluded, and it works. And when the several writers protested that, they resigned their membership, and the rest of the members enthusiastically applauded their resignation. So this is how it was and how it still very much it is. Today even intellectuals are very eager to demonstrate their new political correctness. And the new political correctness is still a loyalty to the ruling party, a loyalty to the nation, a loyalty to the Croatian state. So, I mean, authoritarian regime had collapsed, but it's still, there is fear, and there is still dependence from the ruling party. Nationalism, in fact, gives you a very little space to be critical. And it's better. I can't say it's the same as it was 20 years ago, but considering that 20 years have passed, it is, we still, I can't say in my free conscience that we have a complete freedom. One of the reasons is that media and the government are very closely tied together, not through the party connections, but through the connection between the capital and the government. So it's a different kind of connection, but it's still ruling the freedom of expression in at least in Croatia and Serbia and Bosnia. These are the countries I know a little bit more about. So they are acting, journalists for example, as a transmitters of power, of party power, and creating, and this is interesting because it goes up and down. Sometimes it's not modern. For example, when we were entering a year ago, almost a year ago, European Union. Croatia is the last member of European Union. Before that, there was very much European propaganda. There was a small anti-European propaganda, of course, but I mean then, for example, also HDZ, that is the conservative party of Tudjman, the right-wing party, was insisting on the membership of European Union, so they were advocating European Union, but very soon as Croatia entered European Union, they started this anti-union propaganda, seeing that nothing goes as it should have gone in their heads, in their imagination, and it really didn't, because Croatia entered in a very bad moment where economic situation was very, very bad. So when we are thinking about positive role of intellectuals, we have also to remember important names such as Adam Miknik, who is here, and if you haven't seen or heard him, you should. So yesterday he was introduced to your prime minister at the meeting with Prime Minister. Tim Snyder said this is the biggest Pole living, and I completely agree to that. So the big Pole, Adam Miknik, Jacek Kuron, Bronislaw Geremek, who unfortunately died, Václav Havel, Jiří Dinsbír, Miklos Harasdi, János Kis, George Konrad, and all these are the names that you have heard of, but these are what we could, you know, qualify as the other side of intellectual activity. The ideas of civil society, of introducing morale into politics, remember what Havel was talking about, of living truth, this is his expression of political pluralism, would have been impossible without efforts of people like them. But what happened to them after the revolution? Are they still important? We all know what happened to Havel, but are these people still important? They play their big role in preparing revolution, as those play the big role in preparing the wars. And it seems to me that they have, for a period of time, lost their influence. If so, I would say it's normal. The more normal the society, the less need for public moralists, redeemers of people, or intellectual heroes. It is a sign of normality. On the other hand, for former Yugoslavia, for example, in the society that is far from normalization, because of nationalism and because of lack of reconciliation, which is another topic, and where we still have a tough struggle between authoritarian and liberal forces, perhaps critical intellectuals were written off too early in belief that democracy will take care of itself. Are they still needed? At certain point long ago, one intellectual turned down Havel's invitation to take up governmental position with the argument that someone has to remain independent. Havel pointed out that if all intellectuals would follow his example, there is a danger that nobody will be able to remain independent because there would be nobody in power who would make possible and guarantee his independence. Perhaps intellectuals in their 19th century role of preachers, politicians, teachers, and national leaders, all in one, are still necessary in our part of the world. So this is then for you to answer to these questions. Are intellectuals necessary in this society? What role do they play in this society? Are they bad guys? Are they good guys? And in what role do they play right now in respect to the government? In my view, one has to be always critical, always hold the mirror against any kind of a government. So thank you very much for your attention. I hope I wasn't terribly boring, and I expect your questions. Thank you. And nobody expected what happened since their death in Ukraine. But in the meantime, Ukraine is trying very hard to embark on this train, really. Well, we don't know what's going to happen. But I think what had happened at the end of last year and beginning of this year is quite magnificent at the loss of lives, unfortunately. But so yes, a lot has changed, and this is one of the reasons I think we are here to support this struggle for pro-European government and democracy in this country. Yeah, and that's fascinating. And I think there is a lot of people who are not only supporting you but admiring Ukrainian people to be able to do all of that, and watching very carefully what is going to happen, and also being very much afraid of what might happened here. Yeah, thank you for the compliment, and I don't know how topical it is, but and I cannot really judge very well what would bring the solution of Daytonization. I only can make a parallel to what happened in Bosnia. And in Bosnia happened catastrophe. It's, in my opinion, in Bosnia, it was not a good solution. And you might have heard in the autumn there were Bosnians in the street again protesting against the government that they have. It's a stagnation in Bosnia. There is nothing happening. And I tell you why. The reason is a simple one. They are fed by the international community. You will be shocked if I tell you that there is, in a country of 4 million people, divided in cantons and well, it's very complicated to explain the structure, but trust me, it's very complex. And there are 163 ministers. Do you want, I mean, these ministers, they have drivers, they have secretaries, they have offices, they have cars. Do you want these people? And they can give jobs to their relatives. Do you think these people are going to leave their jobs without fighting? Never. So, no, really, seriously speaking, it didn't show a good result in Bosnia. But when we are making parallels between what happened in former Balkans and what is happening here, we have to think about another thing, and this is the size of Ukraine. For example, I do not trust European Union because European Union did nothing in Bosnia, didn't resolve anything. Not even the war would have been finished without Americans. American bombing finished the war. Dayton Agreement, Holbrooke twisting the arm of Milosevic. These are the people who understand only the language of power, of violence. So, European Union was not capable of resolving a tiny little country like this compared to Ukraine. Now, the curse and the blessing of Ukraine is that it's so big. And you can't dismiss it like that. You can't say, okay, this is some small, shitty country, who cares about it? We are going to pour some money there and that's it. Keep these ministers going on. Doesn't matter. But for Ukraine, it can't be. Ukraine is too big and too important. So they will have to come with some, hopefully, some measures and some solutions that are not a joke, that are not to be laughed at. Personally, from the experience I have, Daytonization would not be such a good idea because this would have been, it would have been much easier than for Putin to swallow one by one. Yeah. I don't know if I answered your question, but well, actually, in our situation, it was different, and there were mainly female intellectuals who were opposing the nationalism and the war, and so you can draw whatever conclusions you want from that, but this is how it was, and for some reason or the other, they were not so fanatical about the. So they paid the price, you know. We have the case of 5 intellectuals that were practically so much smeared in the newspapers that they had to, you know, they couldn't work. They had to. Some of them left country and so on. I am one of them, I have to say. And so the consequences of that behavior are great, especially during the war, because you are risking quite a lot. And yeah, but I would not go being a feminist myself. I do not want to make further conclusion along that line that, for example, that it's more natural for women to be against the war. I think it is, but I mean, it requires a separate, complicated discussion about women and men in general. From the intellectual attitude. Then intellectual should be divided into individuals. And political attitude should be divided among the countries because there is no such a thing as a common politics in European Union, and that's a disaster. And that we have felt very much in the wars in the Balkans. And in every question, there is no something like a European Union foreign policy. There is no something like European Union culture policy. There is no something like European Union economic policy. So it's this interest against that interest. And I think that as far as the journalism goes, it's pretty much along these lines, playing along these lines, and there are very few dissenting opinions. But I think, on the other hand, there is quite a lot of sympathy for, at least sympathy for what is happening, if not understanding. You know, to understand is one thing. You know, first of all, it's a very big shock that what happened with Crimea. I think it's an enormous shock. It takes time to process this, to swallow that, to understand that for the first time after the Second World War, as somebody yesterday said, I forgot who it was, there was aggression. One country went into another country and took part of it. I mean, this is shocking, and I think that it takes time to understand it. On the other hand, I think the kind of justification of Putin and Putin politics, it's in my opinion, there are two reasons for that. One is fear, and the other is fear of helplessness, in the sense that you do not know who could do something there. You know, for sure, Americans are not going to bomb there. You know, NATO is not going to act. The Third World War will not happen, in my opinion. And who is then going to stop Putin? It's very much up to. I am afraid that apart from the sympathies that intellectuals in the West are expressing, you are very much alone in this struggle. I don't know how much it could help you, and this is why we are here, all of us, and you know, at this conference. So you are actually talking to the wrong guys, because we are trying to be good guys. But it comes from not really knowing, being afraid, and knowing that there is no really any solution in terms of actual power acting there. So it's a sad fact that Ukraine is pretty much alone. From of course, it's a personal view, but also the other side of that is that Ukraine is, again, a big country, which means a big potential, which means a big possibility to defend yourself and to build something out of this situation. It's, of course, not satisfactory answer, but I mean, I am not a politician. Yes. Well, you have to say.
Could we understand it other, you know, when you are going on all these conferences?
Well, I mean, your experiences are part of yourself, of your view, of your personality. You can't get rid, even if you want, of your experience. And of course, there is very often some misunderstanding. I also feel it when I'm talking to my colleagues who come from the West and who are very theoretical, as you say, and who often do not know very much about our conditions of living, that we are missing each other. Missing in the meaning is different, and I do think I wouldn't claim that it's ontological difference, but it is the experience that defines us. And therefore, just because of this experience, whatever they say, we know, or at least I know, that changes cannot go as fast as we need them to happen. It's a very slow process. And I think struggling with mentality, it's one of the biggest struggles we have. And therefore, I think that in this part of the world, we still need people who are going to, in moral terms actually, to tell us what to do. Why? Because we cannot trust our politicians. In Eastern Europe, in the period of transition, we have learned this very tough lecture, and this is lesson, and this is, we can't trust. They are totally corrupt. They do not represent public values and public needs. So there must be someone somewhere who will deserve our trust and who can represent public issues, because they are not. So what do? You as a people, as a country, you are left alone. You don't trust the politicians. They are corrupt. Media are corrupt. So you must, like in the old times, in the bad old times, you have to have here and there some voice that you can trust, that you can. The problem, however, is another, is where they express themselves, How can you express yourself in the world which is totally ruled by media that are privatized and that are also politically governed, you know? For example, if I have some opinion that I want to express, I will hardly find a platform in Croatia where I could say something which is critical or important or anything, because there are no such platforms any longer. So we are caught into this, not only what and how, but where. And this is one of the big problems, because you do not have a platform to address and to defend public interest.
This is why you publish in The Guardian.
Well, from time to time, yes. But it's sad because, you know, when you, for example, speaking of publishing Guardian or in, for example, Süddeutsche Zeitung, I have noticed one very funny phenomena, and this is that Croatian people who work in the government or who work in the media, they register every time I write something in English, but if I write something in German, in Swedish, in Danish or something is published in some other countries, they don't register it because they don't know the language.
In Ukraine, you have two platforms, Facebook and YouTube.
Well, I have my opinion about this technological change and so on. There is one question back there, and that would be the last question, I think. No, okay. Who was the? I can't. And I think it's a very good comment. But as I said, I leave all the comparison and to the questions about Ukraine actually to you. The question about a commission for reconciliation in former Yugoslavia, it's a very interesting question because I have been dealing with that question of reconciliation and wrote something about that, and my opinion is no, it's not going to work, and it has been such an initiative and it did not work. We have a different culture. In that culture, if you would come out and say, I have killed your child, the mother wouldn't come to you and kiss you and said, my son, I forgive you, but the uncle would kill you tomorrow. So then you should not forget that there is, in the Balkans, there is a very strong tradition, especially in some parts, of a blood feud. So to shed the blood is not in revenge, it's more common than to forgive. I'm talking about centuries back, but this is actually one of the reasons why it doesn't work. It was formed, such a commission, in Sarajevo, and the head of that, I don't know if he's Jakob Finci, if he's still there. It's a Jew, and it absolutely did not and could not work. In my opinion, I can tell you very briefly that. Because the war, and that's my deep experience and conviction, comes from the top, not from the bottom. It has to be incited, and it comes from the top. Therefore, the peace should take exactly the same way. It should come from the top. And what does that mean? It means a whole series of attempts from the state institutions. It doesn't mean only that this has been done, that the president of one country comes to say, I'm very sorry, then the other comes, I'm very sorry, and so on. They go ceremonially. Yes, on the level of ceremony too, on the level of institutions too. But so political level, institutional level, but most of all on the level of history, because one of the causes that this war was, or one of the reasons that this war was started is history. The fact that we did not have history, the fact that we have ideology. So historians have an enormous, big, important task to finally produce some kind of, I'm saying some kind of truth. Why? Because I think that we have to have reconciliation about this truth. A couple of years ago in Serbia, they denied Srebrenica. They said no, students from the law faculty put out a declaration saying Srebrenica never happened. Srebrenica is a place where in 1995, 8,000 Muslim men and the boys were killed, exterminated. No, so it's a huge mass grave. A couple of years later, Serbian parliament put out a declaration recognizing Srebrenica. So the task of historians and then task of people who are in education to produce the books, the textbooks that hold some kind of, I have to say this, common truth, because without common truth, there is no justice. And without that, the whole process of reconciliation falls into nothing. Thank you very much. Thank you.